So this is the third lesson in a four-part series looking at the evidence surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in this particular lesson, we're going to look specifically at the evidence surrounding the empty tomb itself. Was it indeed empty? Why was it empty? How can we determine that it was empty, and so forth? So again, it'll follow the same format. We're going to go through a little bit of information. There's going to be about a 20-minute video that I'm going to share from Lee Strobel, taken from his book, The Case for Easter, and then just a quick review of the facts. So let me get us started here, and I'm going to share the screen and we'll get started. So again, the title of this series of lesson is Easter, the Evidence, looking at the historical context, facts, and so forth surrounding the events of 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. A quote here from William Lane Craig from his book, The Sun Rises. Without the belief in the resurrection, the Christian faith could not have come into being. The disciples would have remained crushed and defeated men. The cross would have remained the sad and shameful end of Jesus's career. The origin of Christianity, therefore, hinges on the belief of the early disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead. So Christianity would not even be a faith system today, nor would it have even gotten off the ground if there wasn't this belief in a resurrection 2,000 years ago. So we're going to look at the evidence. Was the tomb of Jesus really empty? There are skeptics today who will put forth alternative theories as to why there was the claim of an empty tomb. Some say he was never actually put in a tomb. Some say that the body was moved from the original tomb to a different tomb by either the Jewish or the Roman authorities, which led the disciples to go to the wrong tomb and proclaim that a resurrection had taken place because there was an empty tomb. And then some say, of course, the conspiracy theory that the disciples actually came and stole the body from the tomb and then went around Jerusalem proclaiming that a resurrection had taken place. As Mr. Craig states, the Christian faith, its very foundation, hinges on whether in fact the resurrection actually took place. There was actually a bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he exited the grave. So let's take a look at what Lee Strobel, again taken from his book, The Case for Easter, what he has to say on the subject.
According to the Guinness Book of World Records, he was the most successful lawyer who ever lived. As a defense attorney, he won 245 murder trials in a row, either before the jury or on appeal. He was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth and became a justice on the highest court of his land. And even though he had grown up in a nominal Christian home, Sir Lionel Luckhoo was skeptical about whether Jesus really did rise from the dead. But then he decided to take his monumental legal skill and apply it to the historical data for the resurrection so he could come up with a definitive verdict in the case for Easter. Well, if anyone knew what constitutes reliable evidence, it was Sir Lionel. He knew how to spot every possible loophole. He knew how to test facts to see whether they withstood scrutiny. In short, he was not the kind of person who could easily have the wool pulled over his eyes. Well, after thoroughly investigating the resurrection from a legal perspective, Sir Lionel finally reached his conclusion, which he summarized in one sentence. He said, quote, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. This from the most successful attorney who ever lived. As I've been saying, the case for Easter is powerful and persuasive. The famous professor of history at Oxford University, Thomas Arnold, put it this way. He said, "I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proven by better evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God has given us that Christ died and rose from the dead." Well, so far, we've considered 2 of the 4 E words that summarize evidence for the resurrection. The first E is for execution, and we've seen that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically indisputable, to quote a noted atheist historian. The second E stands for early, and we've seen how the early accounts of the resurrection come so immediately after Jesus' death that they can't be dismissed as mere legend. But that's not all we have. Now we'll consider the third E, which stands for empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that after Jesus' death, his body was buried in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish council. The tomb was sealed, and Matthew tells us it was guarded, and yet it was discovered empty on that first Easter morning. Now, some skeptics say that the real reason the tomb was empty was because the body was never in it in the first place. The agnostic New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman wrote a book called How Jesus Became God, in which he cast doubt about whether the body of Jesus was really entombed. While he said he can't definitively say that the burial reports about Jesus are false, he said this: if the Romans followed their normal policies and customs, and if Pilate was the man whom all our sources indicate he was, then it is highly unlikely that Jesus was decently buried on the day of his execution in a tomb that anyone could later identify. Well, that would certainly explain why the tomb was empty, but is he correct? Actually, several scholars, including Craig A. Evans, who has authored 50 books and lectured at Oxford, Cambridge, and Yale universities, wrote their own book to rebut Ehrman. They call theirs How God Became Jesus. And in it, Evans makes the convincing case that the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial are consistent with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law. He added that it's simply erroneous to assert that the Romans didn't permit the burial of the executed, including the crucified. To support that contention, he quotes from a summary of Roman practice and procedure from that era, known as the Digesta, which says this, quote, "The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives. And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can be claimed, in order that their bones and ashes, after having been collected, may be buried. The bodies of persons who have been punished should be given to whoever requests them for the purpose of burial." Besides, we have archaeological evidence that crucifixion victims were buried. In 1968, the remains of a buried crucifixion victim from the 1st century were unearthed with a 7-inch spike driven through the heel bone and a bit of olive wood from the cross still attached. Then, in 2018, research was published about a second crucifixion victim. This one had been unearthed from the ground rather than a tomb in 2007. He had been in his early 30s and below average height. His arms appeared to have been tied to the cross by a rope, which was a technique that the Romans sometimes used, and medical examiners found a lesion and unhealed fracture in one of the heel bones, suggesting that his feet had been nailed. In fact, the lesion passed through the entire right heel bone. So there is archaeological confirmation that indeed crucifixion victims were allowed to be buried. In fact, scores of nails bearing calcium from human bones have been discovered in tombs from that area. Said Dr. Craig, quote, "I conclude that the burial of the body of Jesus in a known tomb, according to Jewish law and custom, is highly probable, and that it was the knowledge of the tomb and the discovery that it was empty, in addition to the appearances of Jesus, that led the followers of Jesus to speak in terms of resurrection." Craig also disputed the contention that Pontius Pilate was such a ruthless and brutal leader that he would have refused to allow anyone to take Jesus' body for burial. On the contrary, said Craig, it would have been in Pilate's best interest to act as the gospel said he did and permit Jesus to be entombed. That's because earlier, Pilate got into hot water when he tried to place Roman standards bearing the images of the emperor in Jerusalem. This enraged the Jews because Jewish law forbids the making of divine images, and the Romans considered the emperors to be divine. Pilate nearly had a revolt on his hands. So it would have made sense that he wouldn't risk antagonizing the Jews again by leaving these 3 crucifixion victims on their crosses over Passover, which Jews would have seen as defiling the land. There would have been a riot at the exact time that Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims for the Passover, which is something that Pilate would have wanted to avoid. But what is the affirmative evidence that the tomb of Jesus was empty? Well, there are 3 lines of evidence that converge to make a strong case for the vacant tomb. First, there is what is known as the Jerusalem factor. Dr. William Lane Craig has popularized this argument, which basically says that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to Christians and non-Christians alike. If it were not empty, it would have been highly unlikely for a movement founded on the resurrection to explode into existence in the very same city where Jesus had been publicly executed just a few weeks before. That makes sense, doesn't it? As the renowned scholar C.F.D. Muley of Cambridge University put it, if the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of resurrection, what does a secular historian propose to stop it up with? A second line of evidence for the empty tomb is based on what historians call the criterion of embarrassment. You see, one way historians try to determine if an ancient writer is telling the truth is by whether they include details that are embarrassing to themselves or which hurt their cause. In other words, why would you include an embarrassing fact unless it's true? If you felt the freedom to make up a lie, you'd never report something that damaged your own cause. Now, think about this. Who discovered the tomb to be empty? Women. Matthew 28 says, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. In verses 5 through 7, an angel tells them, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell the disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him." Well, friends, here's the problem. In first century Jewish and Roman cultures, women were lowly esteemed, and their testimony was considered questionable. In fact, they were generally not considered credible by men. They were, in many cases, not even allowed to testify in a court of law. How do we know? Well, the Jewish Talmud says, quote, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." Describing Roman culture, Josephus wrote, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." The point is this: if you're going to make up a false story about the tomb being empty, there's no way you would say that women discovered that it was vacant. It would hurt your case among the very people you're trying to convince. In fact, Christianity was attacked by critics in the 2nd century who said, in effect, hey, you can't trust that story. They say women discovered the tomb empty. No, if the gospel writers felt the freedom to invent the story from whole cloth, they would have bolstered their case by saying a man discovered the tomb empty, maybe John or Peter. But they didn't. Why? Apparently because the truth of the matter is that women did discover the tomb empty, and the gospel writers were committed to telling what really happened, even if it was embarrassing to themselves. So the criterion of embarrassment tells historians that the report of the empty tomb is most likely true. The New Testament scholar I mentioned earlier, Dr. Craig A. Evans, said, "In my view, the tradition of women as the first discoverers is a strong piece of evidence in favor of the historicity of the empty tomb, if not the reality of the resurrection also." Now, the third line of evidence for the empty tomb is perhaps the most persuasive of all. It's called enemy attestation. In other words, what were the opponents of Jesus saying about the empty tomb? We know that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, what their opponents never said was, "Oh yeah? Go open the tomb and you'll see he's still in it." That's all they needed to say, and then the onus would have been on the disciples to prove it. But what did they actually say? We know from the Gospel of Matthew, as well as later accounts by Justin Martyr and Tertullian, that the enemies replied, "The disciples stole the body." Now, think about that. What is that? It's a cover story. They're implicitly conceding that the tomb really is vacant, but they're trying to explain how it got vacant. It's like if you were a teacher and a student came up to you and said, "The dog ate my homework." That student would be admitting, "Look, I don't have my homework, but I can explain what happened to it. The dog ate it." Well, it's the same thing. So even the opponents of Jesus implicitly admitted that the tomb of Jesus was empty, which is a compelling piece of evidence that it really was vacant. So really, everybody, implicitly or explicitly, is conceding that the body is gone. The real question, it turns out, is how did the tomb get empty? The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. And certainly the disciples didn't steal the body. They didn't have the motive. They didn't have the means. They didn't have the opportunity. In fact, we have 7 ancient sources that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. Those 7 sources are the book of Acts, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius, Dionysius of Corinth, in a quote found in Eusebius, Tertullian, and Origen. While we don't have solid historical sources for how all of the disciples actually did die, we do have strong historical data that they were willing to die for their conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead. Friends, the affirmative evidence for the empty tomb is clear and it's convincing. And I don't think that any standard objection raised by critics is able to put the body back in the grave. Now, one objection raised by skeptics is that there are differences between the gospel accounts of the empty tomb, and therefore this casts doubt on their reliability. Let me give you an example. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say multiple women visited Jesus' tomb and discovered it empty. But John's gospel only mentions Mary Magdalene. But does that undermine their credibility? Well, not really. It seems likely that John is aware of the presence of other women, but he is simply focusing his attention on Mary. After all, it's not uncommon for ancient writers to spotlight one person among others. In fact, here's the thing. John reports Mary announcing to Peter and John, they have taken the Lord from the tomb and we don't know where they have laid him. Who's the we to whom Mary refers? Probably the other women who are also present. So there's really no problem here. What historians notice is that the differences between the gospel accounts are only in the secondary details. The core of the story is the same. Joseph of Arimathea has the body of Jesus put in his tomb. The tomb is visited by a small group of women followers of Jesus early on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, and they find that the tomb is empty. They see a vision of angels saying that Jesus is risen. So we can have great confidence in this common core, even if there are some differences in the secondary details due to the different perspectives of the authors. I have to agree with Michael Grant, a usually skeptical historian who is a highly respected professor at Edinburgh University. He said this, "True, the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels. But if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty." Even so, we have to remember that an empty tomb does not a resurrection make. It's necessary to make the case that Jesus physically conquered the grave, but it's not sufficient. We need one more category of evidence to make the case for Easter, and we'll examine that the next time we get together. We can draw great comfort from the fact that Jesus conquered the grave, because it means that we will too if we follow him. At times when life seems fragile, that's a wonderful encouragement. One of America's greatest clergymen, George Whitefield, preached 18,000 times during the years that he lived in the 18th century. But out of all of his teachings, I have one favorite sentence. I thought of it several years ago when an unexpected medical crisis landed me in the hospital in critical condition. At times like that, we cling to the fact that Jesus isn't in his tomb, but he's alive. He's there to comfort and to encourage us. And if I were to close my eyes for the last time in this world, I knew I would open them in the next world and see my Savior face to face. Whitefield's words are these: "Thou mayest perhaps have a natural fear of dying. The body and the soul do not care to part without a little sympathy and a groan. But, oh, look yonder, look up to heaven, see there thy Jesus, thy Redeemer."
So I hope you found that evidence compelling. Now let's just review quickly, and that is to say, obviously, that as Lee said, there are some skeptics who say that there was an empty tomb only because Jesus was never put in a tomb. And of course, Lee Strobel went through the evidence relative to the archaeological findings, customs and practices, as well as the Roman edicts and practice relative to, in fact, permitting and calling for bodies of crucified victims to be given over to family members who request it. And of course, the scripture indicates that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were members of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish council, they were leaders of the community, actually came and asked for the body. So that would be consistent, obviously, with this practice. And of course, there is no evidence from anyone recorded that Jesus was buried anywhere other than a tomb. The only account we have is that he was buried in a tomb, and they, as we saw in earlier lessons, come from very, very early sources. Lee Strobel outlined the evidence for the tomb, the Jerusalem factor, the fact that this all took place in Jerusalem, and people who were both skeptics, opponents, and disciples and followers of Jesus alike knew where that tomb was. And so clearly the proclamation of a tomb being empty would have been very easy to either prove or disprove right at the moment in time. The fact of the criterion of embarrassment, that if you're proclaiming something like this, you're not going to use evidence that can be very easily either disproved or you're going to cite examples, you're going to cite evidence that is embarrassing to you. And he talked about the idea that the notion that the empty tomb was originally discovered by women in this culture would not have been something you would make up. You would report it if it were true, which is what they did, but it's not something, if you were fabricating a story, that you would say, that you would use. And then, of course, the enemy attestation, the fact that the opponents of Jesus did not dispute the fact that the tomb was empty. And in fact, as he said, there are multiple sources, both within Scripture as well as outside of Scripture, that attest to, and even enemies that, like I said, attest to the fact that the tomb was indeed empty. So we can be very, very confident that the tomb of Jesus was empty on that first Easter morning. So I hope that the evidence that you've heard was convincing to you, that the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth on the third day after having been crucified was found empty. And indeed, as far as the theory relative to someone stealing the body, what motivation would anybody have to do that? The Jewish leaders wouldn't do it. The Romans wouldn't do it. And in fact, if they had moved the body, once the disciples claimed an empty tomb, they would have just pointed them to the correct tomb, or even gone to it themselves and dragged the body out and said, here it is, there has been no resurrection. So needless to say, that did not happen. And it did not happen because the real tomb was empty, the body was not moved, and so they could not produce a body to disprove the resurrection. Again, we talked about the claim of women being the first ones to discover the body. And why is it important the opponents of Christ didn't ask the disciples to prove the tomb was even empty when they proclaimed a risen Jesus Christ? Why? Because in fact, they had gone to the correct tomb and that tomb was empty. So again, I hope that this evidence that you've heard and seen today is convincing to you, that it either solidifies your faith or challenges your skepticism, one or the other. But either way, I appreciate your joining. And again, there's one more lesson to go where we're going to talk about the eyewitnesses themselves. God bless you.